Have you ever had difficulties advocating for yourself, finding your voice, or overcoming some of those self-limiting beliefs such as, I don't think I'm good enough for blank, or I don't know if I'm ready for blank? Then you'll want to tune into this episode as I chat with CFO Saeideh Fard, where she reminds us that it takes all kinds. And then she also provides some practical advice to overcome some of those internal obstacles that I had mentioned. Let's dive in. Welcome back to another episode of The Leader Within. Today, I'm excited to introduce Saeideh Fard, an executive leader recognized for bringing operational perspectives to financial decisions in high growth and transforming organizations. Fostering analytically driven growth cultures and mentoring others to achieve success are her reasons for what she does. So as a culture and change advocate who has led high-performing teams through innovative and complex change projects in over 5 different sectors, I'm excited to have her share her insights with you. Well, welcome, Sai. Thank you so much for joining me today. And you've had a very successful career. You've worked your way up to a C-suite role. You've developed a very strong personal brand on LinkedIn. So I'm curious, along the way, what are attributes of leaders or mentors who have played a key role in your success?
So first, I do want to say thank you for having me featured. I felt honored to be reached out to. In terms of your question, if you're asking sort of what stands out from my own career on both leadership and also just anything to do with my own personal brand, I think the biggest thing that I thought through as you asked this question sort of in advance of us chatting here had a lot to do with thinking through sort of organic buildup of the leadership brand. Because I think as we go through our careers, there's just not a lot of moments where we stop and think, okay, am I building something that is true to who I am? But often that's exactly what's happening. If we've achieved success, there's usually been moments and breakthroughs where we've realized something that's not specific to our career branding or anything that's even intentional is coming from our childhoods or is coming from our unique personal experiences earlier on in life. That's just kind of shining through. It's differentiating us. And as I look back on my own career, I'm realizing now, 20 years in, that's actually been one of the biggest takeaways, that those moments just kind of differentiate you, help you feel more confident in the voice that you have, but they also allow others to trust you and your authenticity because you're being true to something that's uniquely you. So happy to go into more detail if that's useful for your audience.
For sure. And were there role models along the way that you're like, hey, they've developed such a great leadership brand. I need a ton of time into that. Because I know going through my career, I can't really pinpoint being taught that, but it was modeled to me, right? So I'm curious for yourself, were there people around you that you're like, hey, there's value to this?
Yeah, I think as I look back at my career, I think there's been different types of leaders that have modeled leadership or management to me. The earlier ones, I think there's technical. So I'm just going to separate out the types of leadership that I've experienced and kind of benefited from. Earlier on in our careers, there's a lot of technical leadership, folks that are showing us not just what to learn, but how to learn the technical material. And so that second part is really, really important. And let's say in my middle career in the last 20 years, the middle years, I was really thinking through how do I prioritize looking for that type of mentorship and finding leaders that aren't just teaching me something technical, but they're teaching me how to learn something technical on my own terms or something that might feel out of my reach in the current realm of the role that I'm in. But how do I get those experiences without having to actually go through specific years or specific roles? That was really, really valuable. So I think that's the piece that often is missed in career management in those early to intermediate years. In the later years, let's call it the last 10 years, which has been mostly senior executive or senior leadership years of my career, I've started to look for leaders that are more authentic sounding or feeling to me and really listening to why I find their voice resonating with me, because often those are voices that are resonating with others as well. So there's been a bit of reflection in that last 10 years on, what are the leaders that feel like they're multipliers without even technical expertise. And in the last 10 years, what I've noticed is authenticity matters, right? I'm really deeply attracted to voices that have unique points of view, folks that have had, let's call it deeper, tougher experiences earlier on in life, and they have developed a way of thinking about those earlier life experiences as more superpowers than challenges that have held them back. And I realize when I look around, those are the same voices that resonate with others. And so I think over the years, probably in the last 5 years, that's been the deepest influence in, sort of me thinking about what are those tougher themes in my own background that are really superpowers. And I think everybody has them. It's just tapping in and finding it and really spending time with it, which is sometimes painful in the moment, but they can differentiate us quite a lot as leaders.
I feel like there's so much to unpack there, but I think one thing I'm going to focus on right now is when it comes to the challenges part, because like you said, it's sometimes the things that we have to overcome are the greatest like lessons essentially. So for you, I would imagine climbing all the way up to an executive leadership role is not the easiest, right? Because they're very few compared to everything at the bottom. So what would you say is like one of the biggest challenges, whether it's internally or externally, that you've had to overcome that you're like, hey, like I think that actually really helped build me into the leader I am today?
The thing that stands out the most as I think about it, the thing that I've had to overcome that's probably been the biggest obstacle, and this may be a surprise, it's not actually an external theme, it's actually an internal theme. So I think back to when I started my career, graduating from university, getting into that first job. I think there's always that voice inside every one of our heads that gives us a ceiling, or it defines for us sort of what challenges there are in front of us and focuses on those challenges. And so for me, the biggest thing to overcome, I think it's that limit or that box that I felt earlier on in my career I set for myself. And so I'll give you a tangible example. Sort of in my mid-career, I was given a really big compliment by a CEO that I was working with, a little bit by fluke, because there was some reorganization and there was a bit of chaos in one of the organizations that I was working in. And so for a few months, I was working directly with a CEO and in a tech organization. And so in that experience, what he said to me is, Sai, I think you would make a really great CFO at some point in your career. And I remember that really shocking me and him being shocked by the fact that aspiration actually shocked me. And so he asked me, what is the reason that you don't see yourself that way? And I pointed to what came immediately to mind, which is I don't look like and I don't seem the same as the types of leaders that I've seen above me. And so I named a couple who had come and gone and who I had admired. And he paused and he said to me, it takes all kinds, which it was an interesting reaction, because he wasn't saying, no, you should go and be exactly like person X or Y. In his own way, he was saying you have some unique attributes and this is how you are going to be successful. And I didn't really understand that until years later in my career. It takes all kinds. It always comes back when I look at career growth and just how we define ourselves. Often we just look for the path that has been demonstrated for us. We don't think about what is inside of us that can create a path, not just for ourselves, but potentially for others. And so that one phrase has really stayed with me as a way of overcoming the voice inside our head. It takes all kinds, which means if you don't feel equipped or ready necessarily, it doesn't mean that you won't get there or that you have to do it exactly the same way as somebody else has done it. You can do it your way.
I appreciate that, because I think it kind of is similar to like Henry Ford's analogy of it's like, how do people know what they want, right? Right. Like along those lines, if they've never seen it before. So then it's up to me to kind of put it out there. So for us internally to kind of reframe that, I think is a powerful thing. And I think where a challenge can come up is when you seek advice from others, because if they have also never seen it before, they are more likely to be like, are you sure? Right. So for you, as you've progressed through your career, how did you kind of develop the fence post of being like, hey, I want to make sure that I have objective perspectives, but not ones that I know are just going to completely pull me down? Or maybe the opposite, where it's like they give you so much great news that they forget to give you constructive feedback that will actually benefit you. So yeah, what does that look like for you when it came to seeking counsel and identifying who you should be taking advice from?
That's actually, I think, an excellent question, because as we manage our careers, we're often told to go get mentors, to look at others' careers, and that advice can be a game changer, right? So those who don't do it, I notice, are missing out on some great feedback or even just mistakes that they don't necessarily have to make along the way. And they can learn from others, right? So there is that element, and I think that's pushed a lot in career management conversations, even just our tendency to go read books by great leaders. What we don't talk about often is how do you find the balance between that and the voice inside your head that may say that you are ready to take on something, or you have a different profile than the folks that are being featured. And often, especially especially I think if there is any level of, let's call it marginalized identity. So whether we are immigrants, if we carry accents, if we've had socioeconomic backgrounds that play out in our head around us not feeling at one with the crowds that are seen as being more successful than folks in our own socioeconomic backgrounds. Or for women, especially if we are a women of color, I think there's a lot of nuance to the advice. And often the advice that comes out is from the lens of folks that have not been marginalized. They've been successful within their own realms. They've certainly worked hard. So this isn't to say that they have not, but they have different lenses, different paths to success than we have. Doesn't mean that those paths are completely irrelevant, not at all. Because, if I think about my own career, most of my mentors have been white, male, non-immigrants. Most of my advocates have been white, male, non-immigrants. And so it doesn't mean that that lens is not useful or not a superpower also. But there have certainly been places in my career where I've had to pause and think about how, the perspective of others may not be the whole picture. So I'll give examples of sort of when that has come up, at interview time, when you're going through executive search, often there's that moment of reflection. So you walk away with a sense of, how did it go? And then you ask for feedback. And so sometimes in that process, especially earlier on in my career, as I was pushing for those executive roles, the feedback has come back either gendered or it hasn't really, and this has often been from exec search recruiters, not necessarily directly from folks that I would be working with. And so I have experienced that, and in particular around gender, right? The comments that on the surface don't look to be gendered, but when you think about would this advice be given to somebody who isn't a woman leader, that advice hasn't been that relevant. And so at those times, I've learned to deploy a different way of thinking around examining my own reaction to the advice. If it hasn't felt relevant, sometimes I've even sought advice on the advice to say, this is what I'm hearing. Would you, as a white male non-immigrant mentor, would you ever receive this type of feedback in the same scenario? And if the answer is no, then I don't let it limit me. And so I think it's important to pause in those moments to realize that advice sometimes can actually have limiting impacts on our assessment of our own abilities and to correct that. And it does take a conscious pause to say, this is a limiting piece of advice. I am not going to let this piece of advice affect me in the same way as I let other advice impact me. But it requires some conscious thinking and pausing and tucking that away.
What a helpful tool to have in your toolbox, right? Because when I think about how much we are inundated, whether it's through social media, through friends and family, and then of course the advice that we actively seek out, whether like you said, it's through books, podcasts, whatever it may be, it can be a lot to filter through. And it's that discernment that plays a big role at the end of it, right? To make sure that it contextually makes sense for the circumstances that you're in, right? And we dived a little bit into that career revelation, and now I kind of want to shift gears to the leadership one, right? You had alluded earlier in your career, there's a lot of that technical leadership that individuals may focus on. And then later it's about the authentic leadership and perhaps like the people management side from the perspective that you're not going to be the be all end all for everything because you're not the expert. You're more so the person that removes barriers for people, right? So for you, what has been one of your biggest leadership revelations to date?
Biggest one, I think, is just around relating to others on their own terms, right? And I think I've led a lot of change in my career. And I think as I used to think of my role as specialized in managing change, as the economy has evolved, I've realized actually all of us as people leaders are change agents today. And the pace of change is so high that there's no longer this allowance for these are the change experts and these are the folks that, are leading sort of status quo jobs as people leaders. So I'm realizing that's actually no longer a differentiated skill. It's just table stakes and we all have to demonstrate that. And so with that, as I think about, what I've learned over the last 10 years in particular, having been there sooner before everybody even had to work in organizations that were changing, there isn't an organization that I can think of that isn't going through change now. But at the time I was thinking, you have to attract people to want to work in organizations that are going through change, whether that change is transformation for growth, whether it's a turnaround, whether it's scaling challenges, I always thought about how do you incentivize people to go on that journey? Because that journey of change isn't always an easy one. It isn't one that all of us are feeling comfortable with. And so how do you make people comfortable with the uncomfortable? That used to be a differentiating skill. Now it's a requirement. But I did have to compete in an earlier stage with other environments that were not changing as much. And so I think thinking about what the other side gets from an experience that is going through change or even our own leadership, I think that's important. And that answer is different for everyone. Right. So I think what that means is that we have to, as leaders, get to know the people that work with and for us in a way that allows us to relate to them and their motivations in how they want to be led. And so it's really people-centered leadership, right? And I know that sounds obvious, right? Like, shouldn't we all have people-centered leadership? But I don't think that's the way that we all operate as leaders. And I think I like the way that you put the role of leadership is one to remove obstacles. It's one to enable learning in this way. And it's even more that in the new economy where change is happening constantly. And as leaders, we often don't have the answers. We know that the staff that work with us also don't have black and white answers. So the problems that we're solving are far less black and white in nature. So we're really equipping others to feel psychologically safe, to innovate, to collaborate more, and to arrive at non-black and white answers that they can defend with critical thinking. And so that skill set, I think, requires, again, our creating psychological safety. And that happens only when you know your people, you know what they're looking for. You can incentivize them with, the types of things that they're looking for, whether it's in their careers or just in their lives. And I think that's starting to be more and more of a table stakes skill set, but we're still evolving as the economy forces all of us as leaders to evolve.
I think you're going to be like every change agent's or change COE's favorite sponsor because like you take that ownership and it sounds like you take it to every single level, right? Because we do need leaders to partner with us to drive effective change and sustainable change, right? And you may have answered this already, but I'm going to ask it anyways, is when it comes to managing resistance through change, what does that look like from a people-centered approach?
It goes back to knowing the why, right? And knowing the why often is very related to knowing the humans that we manage and their motivations. And so resistance to change is almost a given for all of us, including leaders, because sometimes I've had to stop and think about my own reaction to change. As humans, I think we even the ones that love change and working in change environments, there's still a comfort in what we know. And so we have to examine the roadblocks when we're going through change and what is it underlying this. And it's usually fear, but what is the fear coming from, right? And I think taking the time to unpack that, understand and speak to that fear and why that fear might be either illogical, or it might not be supported by the real grounding facts around the output from change. I think that ends up being quite useful. The other one is actually communications. First is know your audience. What is it that they're worried about? How can you help them through that journey? And in an authentic way, not just, here's some corporate jargon around sort of a technical outputs, but just in an authentic way. How can you address that fear at its root? And then the second one is communication. I think, again, these all sound like buzzwords and they've been tools for years, but it feels today as if they are far more important than they ever were, because as humans we are going through a lot more change in the last 5 years, probably more to come, than we ever have. And so being able to communicate well and to authentically convey why fear by itself is not necessarily, the right path to think about success. I find those are the best tools.
I appreciate you sharing that because it really backs up like what the research says about when you're going through change. People who are impacted by it want to hear from their leaders and in an authentic way, right? Not just, hey, like this is a script that was given to you. So, because they can feel like the BS through that, right? And speaking of communication and just that fear piece, I know you're very passionate about advocacy work and you had alluded earlier into like finding your voice and what that looks like as well. So bringing the two together, how has your advocacy work transformed the way that you approach like your leadership, career, etc., and being comfortable with asking what you need and want so that you can actually thrive and succeed?
Great question, that one. I think the advocacy work, so just a little bit about me first to kind of ground whoever is listening in. The advocacy work is fairly new. So I started dabbling into more classic involvement outside of sort of immediate professional roles. I started with some board work and tried to look for areas where my interests were tied to any leadership outside of the immediate role that I had, the CFO roles that I had had. And so that's where I started. It's evolved into more. I'm originally from Iran and have spent 10 years of my life, so about a quarter of my life, living in Iran under the conditions that more and more folks that are watching the news are aware of. And so feminism and the women's rights movement, that's sort of been there for me. I've realized more recently it has been a really important theme in my life since far earlier days than I was conscious of. And so in the last 2 or 3 years, I feel like that understanding of who I am has sort of erupted a little bit upwards as the movement for freedom and for women's liberation in particular has come out of Iran. But as I've examined my own career, I've realized, oh, interesting. You know, after this passion that's kind of poured out of me for the woman life freedom movement and my voice coming out on LinkedIn in particular around that, I've sort of stood back now a year and a half in and realized, oh, very interesting. Even though this was not a named feeling and this passion wasn't, exploding out of me as it is today in the way that it is, it actually has been a theme that has come up throughout my career. It's been the way that I've thought about my own career. It's been the way that I have thought about my voice in the context of speaking up for others. It hasn't just been a voice that has impacted, just like in Iran, it's the women's leadership voice and the voice that I realize I've had in my career hasn't been one that's just impacted women. I've realized I have looked for diversity, equity, inclusion in a lot of, and I've been attracted to that, the principles around that in a lot of the settings in my career. I've often also advocated for youth, and a lot of my mentees have also been men. So I've realized that type of a voice and a perspective that is now pouring out of me in advocacy work, it's actually something that has been there all along. I've been passionate about it. It's come out in different forms. It's made me an ally in different forms across the different parts of my career and in my life. And, the passion that I'm paying attention to now, it's actually been there all along. So it's interesting, I think, as I think about, the benefit of taking on passion projects and really finding our voice that comes from a place of, deep resonance and passion. It does help explain a lot about who we are as humans earlier days. So if we take the time, and it isn't always a comfortable process, there's a lot of emotional energy that goes into advocacy work. If we take the time and we give that outlet some time to live, I guess, in the light, we often discover so much more about what is our authentic leader persona. And for me, that I think is what's come out of the last 18 months. I've learned so much about myself and have been able to explain a lot of my earlier career and potentially where I want to go forward with that knowledge about who I am as a human. And I think all of us have deep passions. It's just reaching within and finding it.
Appreciate you sharing that story. And it kind of made me wonder, it's like, based on the experiences that you've gained, for anyone that does struggle to advocate for themselves, maybe what's one starting point that you would offer them where it's like, okay, this is what maybe you can think about or ask yourself so that you can be comfortable asking for what you need?
I think the first thing I would say is to tap into why we feel uncomfortable with advocating. And that helps us identify, are we working in environments that have either held us back or have added to layers of boxing ourselves in? And all of us at different parts of our lives have worked in environments that have been nurturing and also environments that have been the opposite of that. And so really being able to identify where does our discomfort for advocating come from is important, because sometimes it's the workplaces, sometimes it's actually our own cultural upbringing, sometimes it's limiting messages that we've been given. I often find actually when I tap into the why, some of it is not just cultural. I think it's just the differences between how women and men are raised in almost every culture. And so paying attention to that and really thinking through, if if I was not a woman, would I be having this same doubt? And if the answer is no, then I think it's something I can overcome, because often that voice, again, is limiting. It's inside our head. It doesn't mean that, everyone else externally doesn't have that bias either. But the first step is actually overcoming our own, resistance to speaking up and understanding where does it come from. If we don't spend time unpacking the why, it's harder to advocate for ourselves.
I appreciate that insight. And as we slowly wrap up our conversation, when it comes to this question, what's the first thing that comes to mind? What does it take to unleash the potential of individuals or organizations?
I think the first thing is know yourself. This is if you're an individual. For an organization, it's probably also the same. It's know what you stand for, because without it, it's difficult to articulate a strategy and to execute on a strategy.
I had to sit with that one for a moment because it can definitely get lost, right? You might have that iteration initially, but then as you grow and scale and go through a lot of change, it can get lost in the mix, right? And my last question to you is, what's one thing that you're working on that you're super excited about?
So you touched on it. It was my passion project. I am speaking up on the women life freedom movement quite actively, whether it's on LinkedIn or just in terms of connecting with folks that across the world that are attracted to this cause, both Iranians and also a ton of allies across the world. And that's been incredibly enriching in the last while, and I'm looking forward to more of it.
Well, you're doing a lot of impactful work. Thank you for continuing to share your voice on LinkedIn. And I appreciate you sharing your insights today. And to everyone else that's tuned into another episode, thank you so much for your time and attention. It means more to me than you'll know. And I can't wait to stay in touch with you on my next episode. Till then, stay safe.